The weeks following the rescue operation brought a noticeable shift in how Sarah was treated by her fellow recruits. The successful mission had earned her a level of respect that she hadn't experienced since arriving at Fort Carson. However, the fundamental questions about her physical capabilities remained, and the training program continued to push everyone to their limits. Commander Jackson had taken a particular interest in Sarah's progress since the rescue mission. He began observing her training sessions more frequently, taking notes and asking instructors detailed questions about her performance. Sarah noticed his attention but couldn't determine whether it was positive or concerning. During a particularly challenging combat exercise, Sarah's squad was tasked with defending a position against a simulated enemy attack. The scenario required them to hold their ground for 6 hours while under constant pressure from opposing forces using blank ammunition and laser simulation equipment. As the exercise progressed, it became clear that the attacking force was better equipped and more numerous than anticipated. Sarah's defensive position came under heavy simulated fire, and several of her teammates were killed by the laser systems, forcing her to cover a larger section of the perimeter with fewer people. Marcus, who was commanding the defense, found himself relying on Sarah's tactical observations more than he had expected. "Martinez, what do you see on the eastern approach?" he asked during a brief lull in the fighting. Sarah had been studying the attackers' patterns for hours. They're concentrating their forces for a major push, but they're leaving their left flank exposed. If we can get 2 people around to that position, we can catch them in a crossfire. The maneuver worked perfectly, and Sarah's squad successfully repelled the attack. But the physical demands of the 6-hour exercise left her completely exhausted. As the other recruits celebrated their victory, Sarah sat quietly, trying to recover from the sustained effort. Dr. Chen approached her during the post-exercise medical check. "How are you feeling, Martinez?" she asked, noting Sarah's elevated heart rate and obvious fatigue. "I'm fine, ma'am," Sarah replied, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. The extended physical demands were taking a toll that went beyond normal training fatigue. That evening, Commander Jackson requested a private meeting with Sarah in his office. She reported as ordered, uncertain what to expect from the conversation. The commander's office was sparse but professional, with commendations and photographs from his years of service displayed on the walls. "Sit down." "Martinez," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "I've been watching your progress closely since the rescue operation. You've shown exceptional tactical thinking and problem-solving abilities." Sarah waited for the inevitable but that she expected to follow such praise. However, the commander continued, "I'm concerned about the physical demands of the training program and how they're affecting your overall performance. I've spoken with your instructors and reviewed your medical evaluations. Sir, I can handle the physical requirements," Sarah said. Though her voice lacked its usual conviction, Commander Jackson studied her for a long moment. "I'm sure you believe that, Martinez, but I have a responsibility to ensure that every soldier under my command is prepared for the realities of combat. That includes being honest about limitations as well as strengths." He opened a file on his desk that Sarah recognized as her training record. "Your tactical scores are among the highest in your class. Your attention to detail is exceptional. Your ability to think creatively under pressure is remarkable. But your physical performance scores tell a different story." Sarah felt her heart sinking as she anticipated being counseled out of the program, just as so many of her fellow recruits had predicted. "That's why," the commander continued, "I'm recommending you for advanced tactical training. There's a specialized program for soldiers who show exceptional strategic thinking abilities. It would fast-track you to leadership positions where your analytical skills would be most valuable." The offer was both an honor and a disappointment. Sarah understood that it was recognition of her abilities, but it also felt like an acknowledgement that she couldn't succeed in the standard infantry program she had originally chosen. "Sir, I appreciate the opportunity," she said carefully, "but I'd like to complete the standard training program if possible. I believe I can meet all the requirements." Commander Jackson leaned back in his chair, clearly surprised by her response. "Martinez, this specialized program would set you up for a distinguished military career. Why would you want to continue struggling with physical requirements that clearly don't play to your strengths?" For a moment, Sarah considered telling him the truth about why she was really there and what she was trying to prove. Instead, she said, "Sir, I believe that understanding the basic infantry experience is important for any military leader. I want to earn my place the same way everyone else does. The commander studied her face, clearly trying to understand her motivation. I'll tell you what, Martinez. I'll give you 2 more weeks to demonstrate that you can meet the physical standards consistently. If you can't, we'll revisit the specialized training option. Fair enough? Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. As Sarah left the commander's office, she felt the weight of the ultimatum. 2 weeks to prove that she belonged in the standard program, or face the choice between accepting a different path or potentially washing out entirely. That night, she lay in her bunk thinking about the conversation. The specialized program would indeed be an honor, and it would play to her demonstrated strengths. But accepting it would feel like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that she couldn't handle the same challenges as everyone else. Jenny noticed her troubled expression. "Everything okay?" she asked quietly. "Just thinking about the training," Sarah replied, not wanting to discuss the specifics of her meeting with the commander. "You know," Jenny said, "after what happened during the rescue operation, people have started seeing you differently. You've proven you belong here." Sarah appreciated Jenny's support, but she knew that proving herself in one emergency situation wasn't the same as consistently meeting the daily physical demands of military training. The next 2 weeks would determine whether her determination was enough to overcome the physical limitations that everyone, including herself, recognized as real challenges. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah's hand unconsciously moved to her back, feeling the familiar texture beneath her sleeping shirt. Tomorrow would begin what might be her final opportunity to prove that she belonged in the program she had chosen. The specialized training offer was tempting, but it wasn't why she was here. She had come to Fort Carson with a specific goal in mind, and she wasn't ready to abandon that goal just because the path was more difficult than she had anticipated. The question was whether 2 weeks would be enough time to bridge the gap between her current capabilities and the standards she needed to meet. It was a challenge that would test not just her physical abilities, but her mental resilience and her determination to succeed on her own terms. The 2-week deadline created an atmosphere of intense pressure around Sarah's every move. Word had somehow leaked that she was facing a crucial evaluation period, and the entire training company seemed to be watching her performance with renewed interest. Some recruits were openly supportive, while others made bets on whether she would make it through the standard program. Sarah threw herself into the training with desperate determination. She arrived early for every session, stayed late to practice, and pushed herself beyond what seemed physically possible. The extra effort began to show results. Her run times improved slightly, and her performance on the obstacle course became more consistent. But it was during a routine combat readiness exercise that everything changed. The training scenario involved a simulated attack on the base, with recruits assigned to various defensive positions. Sarah was part of a team responsible for securing the communications center, a critical facility that needed to remain operational during the emergency. As the exercise began, the attacking force proved to be more aggressive and better coordinated than in previous simulations. They managed to breach the outer perimeter faster than expected, forcing several defensive teams to fall back to secondary positions. Sarah's team found themselves cut off from the main defensive force, trapped in the communications center with simulated enemy forces closing in from multiple directions. Marcus, who was team leader, tried to radio for support but found that their communications had been jammed by the attacking force. "We're on our own," he announced grimly. "We need to hold this position until the main force can break through to us." The situation deteriorated quickly. 3 of their 6 team members were killed by the laser simulation systems, leaving only Sarah, Marcus, and Rodriguez to defend the entire facility. The attacking force was methodically clearing the building, and it was only a matter of time before they reached the communications center. That's when Sarah noticed something that changed everything. The building's fire suppression system had been activated by the simulated explosions, and water was beginning to flood the lower level. But more importantly, she could hear sounds coming from what should have been an empty storage room adjacent to their position. "There's someone in there," she told Marcus urgently. "That room is supposed to be empty for the exercise." Marcus looked confused. Must be part of the scenario. Maybe they're setting up for the next phase. But Sarah's instincts told her something was wrong. The sounds weren't consistent with exercise activities. They sounded like someone in distress, Against Marcus's orders to maintain position, she moved toward the storage room door. "Martinez, get back here," Marcus hissed. "You're breaking character." Sarah ignored him and tried the door handle. It was locked, but she could definitely hear movement inside, along with what sounded like muffled calls for help. Using her knowledge of the building's layout from their earlier briefings, she remembered that this particular storage room had an old ventilation grate that connected to the main system. Without hesitation, she began working to remove the grate, using her small size to crawl into the ventilation shaft. What she found on the other side made her heart race. Instructor Sergeant Williams was unconscious on the floor, apparently having fallen and hit his head while setting up equipment for the exercise. Sarah immediately broke radio silence, cutting through the exercise communications with an emergency call. "Medical emergency in Building C, Storage Room 14. Instructor down, appears to be head trauma. This is not part of the exercise." The training exercise came to an immediate halt as medical personnel rushed to the scene. Dr. Chen arrived within minutes and took charge of treating Sergeant Williams, who had indeed suffered a serious head injury from his fall. The quick medical response, triggered by Sarah's decision to investigate the sound she had heard, likely prevented a much more serious outcome. As Sergeant Williams was transported to the base hospital, Commander Jackson approached Sarah, who was still covered in dust from crawling through the ventilation system. "Martinez," he said, his voice carrying a tone she had never heard before. "Walk with me." They moved away from the crowd of instructors and recruits who were discussing the incident. Commander Jackson was quiet for several minutes before finally speaking. "What made you investigate that room?" he asked. "Your team leader gave you a direct order to maintain position." Sarah considered her answer carefully. "Sir, the sounds weren't right for the exercise. I've learned to pay attention when something doesn't fit the expected pattern." "And where did you learn that skill, Martinez?" For the first time since arriving at Fort Carson, Sarah felt like she was facing a question she couldn't deflect or avoid. The commander's tone suggested he already suspected there was more to her background than she had revealed. "Sir, sometimes life teaches you to notice things that others miss," she said finally. Commander Jackson stopped walking and turned to face her directly. "Martinez, I've been in the military for over 20 years. I've seen recruits from every possible background, but your combination of tactical thinking, attention to detail, and survival instincts isn't something that comes from normal life experiences." Sarah met his gaze but remained silent. "I'm going to ask you a direct question," he continued, "and I expect an honest answer. Have you been through trauma that you haven't disclosed in your background check?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. For weeks she had managed to keep her personal history separate from her military training. But now, faced with a direct question from a superior officer who had clearly seen more than she realized, she felt the carefully constructed barriers beginning to crumble. "Sir," she said quietly, "my background check is accurate. Everything I reported is true, but not complete," Commander Jackson observed. "Is it, Martinez?" Sarah's hand unconsciously moved toward her back, and the commander noticed the gesture. "Martinez," he said, his voice becoming gentler. "Whatever you've been through, whatever brought you here, I need to understand it. Not for disciplinary reasons, but because I think you're carrying something that affects everything about how you approach this training." For a long moment, Sarah stood silent, feeling the weight of weeks of doubt and criticism, the pressure of the 2-week ultimatum, and now this direct challenge to the wall she had built around her past. Finally, she made a decision that would change everything. "Sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think you should see something." With trembling hands, Sarah began to remove her uniform shirt. Commander Jackson started to protest but stopped when he saw the look of determination in her eyes. As the fabric pulled away from her back, the commander's expression changed completely. Covering Sarah's entire back was an intricate tattoo that told a story of survival and loss. But it wasn't just artwork. Woven throughout the design were symbols and images that spoke of experiences no 22-year-old should have endured. Scars that had been incorporated into the design told their own story of violence and recovery. Commander Jackson stared in silence for several long moments before Sarah pulled her shirt back on. When she turned around, there were tears in her eyes for the first time since arriving at Fort Carson. "Now you understand," she said simply, "why I can't quit." The sun had reached its peak when the squad began their approach to the third and final village on their patrol route. The heat was becoming oppressive, and Marcus could see sweat stains forming on the uniforms of his teammates despite the relatively cool autumn weather. The rocky terrain made walking more difficult, and everyone was feeling the effects of carrying heavy equipment for several hours. Marcus noticed that Private Johnson was beginning to show signs of fatigue. The young soldier's movements had become less precise, and he was breathing more heavily than the situation warranted. Marcus made a mental note to monitor Johnson's condition closely and possibly recommend a short rest break. If his symptoms worsened, the path to the final village led through a narrow valley with steep hills rising on both sides. It was exactly the kind of terrain that made experienced soldiers nervous, because it offered limited escape routes and numerous potential hiding spots for enemies. Captain Williams had chosen this route because intelligence suggested it was safer than the main road. But Marcus could see that several members of the squad were uncomfortable with the tactical disadvantage of being caught in a confined space. Sergeant Thompson had moved to the front of the formation and was using hand signals to communicate with the point guards. His massive frame moved with surprising grace as he navigated the rocky ground, his rifle held at the ready, and his eyes constantly scanning the high ground on both sides of the valley. The silence was almost complete except for the sound of boots on rock and the occasional whisper of wind through the sparse vegetation. Marcus found himself holding his breath as they moved deeper into the valley, his medical training making him acutely aware of how vulnerable they were in their current position. Suddenly, Thompson raised his fist in the universal military signal for halt. The entire squad froze immediately, each soldier dropping into a defensive position and scanning their assigned sector for threats. Marcus crouched behind a large boulder, his hand instinctively moving to check that his radio was easily accessible. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sound of a bird calling from somewhere high up on the hillside. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat in his ears and feel sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the cool air. Thompson slowly lowered his fist and signaled for the squad to continue moving, but his body language suggested that he had seen or heard something that concerned him. The formation resumed its advance through the valley, but everyone moved more cautiously now, with weapons ready and senses heightened. They were approximately halfway through the valley when the world exploded around them. The first explosion came from their left flank, a massive blast that sent rocks and debris flying through the air and temporarily deafened everyone in the squad. Before Marcus could fully process what was happening, automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions on both sides of the valley. Ambush! Thompson's voice roared over the chaos as soldiers dove for cover behind whatever protection they could find. Marcus threw himself behind a cluster of large rocks just as bullets began striking the ground where he had been standing moments before. His medical training kicked in immediately, and he began mentally cataloging the positions of his squad mates and assessing their immediate medical needs based on what he could see. Private Johnson had been caught in the open when the attack began, and Marcus could see him lying motionless about 20 meters away. Blood was visible on his uniform, but Marcus couldn't tell from his position how seriously the young soldier was injured. Sergeant Thompson was returning fire from behind a large boulder, his rifle barking repeatedly as he tried to suppress the enemy positions. Captain Williams was shouting orders into his radio, calling for air support and medical evacuation while simultaneously directing his soldiers' defensive efforts. Another explosion rocked the valley, this one closer to Marcus's position. The blast wave hit him like a physical blow, and he felt small rocks and dirt raining down on his helmet and shoulders. His ears were ringing, and for a moment he struggled to maintain his focus. Medic! The call came from somewhere to his right, but the ongoing gunfire made it difficult to pinpoint the exact location. Marcus forced himself to remain calm and methodical, despite the chaos surrounding him. He keyed his radio and called Captain Williams. "Sir, this is Rodriguez. I have at least one casualty visible, and reports of others needing medical attention. Request permission to begin treatment." "Negative, Rodriguez." The captain's voice crackled through the radio static. "Too much incoming fire. Stay in cover until we can suppress their positions." Marcus understood the tactical logic of the captain's order, but every instinct in his body was screaming at him to help the wounded soldiers. He had trained for exactly this type of situation, but the reality was more intense and chaotic than any training scenario could simulate. The gunfire continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Marcus could hear the distinctive sounds of different weapons being fired, and his training allowed him to distinguish between the American M4 rifles used by his squad and the AK-47s being fired by their attackers. Gradually, the volume of incoming fire began to decrease as the squad's return fire found its targets. Marcus heard Thompson shouting tactical directions to the other soldiers, coordinating their defensive fire to maximum effect. The big sergeant's combat experience was clearly evident in the way he managed the squad's response to the ambush. "Rodriguez," Captain Williams's voice came through the radio again. "We've got a lull in the incoming fire. Move to Johnson's position and assess his injuries. Thompson will provide covering fire." Marcus didn't hesitate. He grabbed his medical kit and sprinted from his cover toward Private Johnson's position, keeping low and moving in an irregular pattern to make himself a more difficult target. Thompson's rifle fired steadily above him, the big sergeant placing precise shots at suspected enemy positions to keep their heads down. Johnson was conscious, but in obvious pain when Marcus reached him. A quick assessment revealed a gunshot wound to his upper left arm, and multiple lacerations from rock fragments caused by the explosions. The arm wound was bleeding heavily but didn't appear to have hit any major arteries. "Stay calm, Johnson," Marcus said as he began treating the wounds. "You're going to be fine, but I need you to stay still and let me work." Marcus applied pressure to the gunshot wound while simultaneously assessing Johnson for other injuries. His training had taught him to work quickly but thoroughly, never assuming that the most obvious injury was the only one present. The young soldier was pale and shaking, symptoms that could indicate shock or simply fear and adrenaline. Marcus started an IV to provide fluids and pain medication while continuing to monitor Johnson's vital signs. "How bad is it, Doc?" Johnson asked, his voice weak but steady. "You're going to be fine," Marcus replied honestly. "The bullet went through your arm without hitting bone or major blood vessels. You'll need surgery to clean the wound properly, but you're not in immediate danger." As Marcus worked on Johnson, he could hear the ongoing battle around them. The enemy fire had decreased significantly, but sporadic shots were still being exchanged between the opposing forces. He knew that their current position was not secure, and that they needed to either eliminate the remaining threats or evacuate to a safer location. Captain Williams appeared beside them, crawling on his belly to stay below the line of sight of potential snipers. "How is he, Rodriguez?" the captain asked. "Stable, sir. He needs evacuation for proper surgical treatment, but he's not critical," Marcus replied while continuing to monitor Johnson's condition. "Good work. We've called for air support and medical evacuation, but it's going to be at least 30 minutes before they can reach us. Can you keep him stable until then?" "Yes, sir," Marcus answered without hesitation. What Marcus didn't know was that the ambush was far from over, and that his real test as both a medic and a soldier was just beginning. The temporary lull in gunfire lasted only 15 minutes before the enemy launched their second wave of attacks. This time they came from a different direction, suggesting that the insurgents had been moving through the hills to flank the American position, while the squad was focused on treating Johnson and calling for support. Marcus was still working on Private Johnson when he heard Sergeant Thompson's urgent warning shout from across the valley, "Contact right. Multiple targets moving down the ridge." The sound of automatic weapons fire erupted again, but this time it was closer and more intense than before. Marcus could hear bullets striking the rocks around their position, sending sharp fragments flying through the air. He instinctively covered Johnson's body with his own, using his armored vest to shield the wounded soldier from the debris. "We need to move Johnson to better cover," Captain Williams shouted over the noise of the firefight. "Can he be moved safely?" Marcus quickly assessed his patient's condition. The bleeding from Johnson's arm wound was controlled, and his vital signs were stable enough for a short movement if necessary. "Yes, sir, but carefully. His IV needs to stay connected." Together, Marcus and the captain half-carried, half-dragged Johnson to a more protected position behind a larger cluster of rocks. The movement was awkward and dangerous, but they managed to relocate without Johnson's injuries worsening. As soon as they reached the new position, Marcus heard another voice calling for medical assistance. This time it was coming from the far end of their defensive line, where several soldiers were engaged in an intense firefight with insurgents who had managed to get within 50 meters of their position. "Medic! Man down, man down." Marcus looked at Captain Williams, who was speaking rapidly into his radio, while simultaneously directing defensive fire. The captain caught Marcus's eye and nodded grimly. "Go, Rodriguez. Johnson is stable enough to leave for a few minutes. Thompson will stay with him." Marcus gathered his medical supplies and began moving toward the new casualty, but this time his route was completely exposed to enemy fire. There was no covered approach, and the wounded soldier was lying in an area where insurgents had direct line of sight from multiple positions. For a moment, Marcus hesitated. His medical training had taught him to never unnecessarily risk his own life because a dead medic couldn't help anyone. But looking at the wounded soldier lying motionless in the open, Marcus made a decision that would define the rest of his military career. He sprinted toward the casualty, running in a low crouch and changing direction every few steps to make himself a harder target. Bullets whined past his head and he could feel the heat from at least one round that passed close enough to singe the fabric of his uniform. The wounded soldier was Corporal Martinez, a squad leader from another unit who had been attached to their patrol for the day. Martinez had taken a round through the chest, and Marcus could see immediately that this was a much more serious injury than Johnson's arm wound. Martinez was conscious but struggling to breathe, a symptom that suggested possible lung damage from the bullet wound. His skin was pale and clammy, and there was blood visible around his mouth indicating internal bleeding. "Stay with me, Martinez," Marcus said as he began his assessment. "I'm going to take care of you." Working under direct enemy fire, Marcus had to fight every instinct that told him to stay low and seek cover. Instead, he forced himself to focus entirely on his patient, blocking out the chaos around him and relying on his training to guide his actions. The chest wound required immediate intervention to prevent Martinez from drowning in his own blood. Marcus quickly inserted a chest tube to drain fluid from the injured lung, while simultaneously starting an IV to provide fluids and pain medication. All around him, the firefight continued with increasing intensity. Marcus could hear American voices shouting tactical commands and coordinates for air support. The distinct sound of grenades exploding mixed with the constant chatter of automatic weapons fire. "How is he?" Sergeant Thompson had somehow managed to move from his position and was now providing covering fire from just a few meters away. "Critical but stable," Marcus replied without looking up from his patient. "He needs immediate evacuation or he's not going to make it." Thompson's rifle fired repeatedly as he engaged targets that Marcus couldn't see. The big sergeant's presence was reassuring, but Marcus knew that even Thompson couldn't protect them indefinitely if the enemy managed to advance to their position. "Air support is 5 minutes out," Thompson called out between bursts of gunfire. "Medical evacuation is right behind them." 5 minutes felt like an eternity when working on a critically wounded patient under fire. Marcus continued his treatment of Martinez while monitoring Johnson's condition by radio. Both patients were stable for the moment, but Marcus knew that could change rapidly without proper medical facilities. It was then that Marcus heard a sound that made his blood run cold. The distinctive whistle of an incoming mortar round growing louder as it approached their position. "Incoming!" Thompson roared, throwing himself over Martinez to protect the wounded soldier. The explosion was massive, much larger than the previous blasts. Marcus felt himself being lifted off the ground by the blast wave and thrown several meters through the air. He hit the rocky ground hard, his medical kit scattering its contents across the battlefield. For several seconds, Marcus couldn't hear anything except a high-pitched ringing in his ears. His vision was blurry and he could taste blood in his mouth. Gradually, his senses began to return, and he realized he was lying face down in the dirt with no memory of how he had gotten there. Marcus forced himself to sit up and immediately began checking for injuries. His left shoulder ached terribly, and there was a deep cut on his forehead that was bleeding into his eyes. But he could move all his limbs and nothing seemed to be broken. The scene around him was devastating. The mortar round had struck close enough to their position to cause significant damage. Thompson was lying motionless beside Martinez, and Marcus couldn't tell if either man was alive. Despite his own injuries and the continuing enemy fire, Marcus crawled toward his patients. Thompson was unconscious but breathing, with what appeared to be a serious head injury from debris thrown by the explosion. Martinez was still alive, but his condition had deteriorated significantly. Marcus now had 3 critical patients to manage, including himself, and no backup medical support. His radio had been damaged in the explosion, so he couldn't communicate with Captain Williams or coordinate with the incoming air support. Working with blurred vision and shaking hands, Marcus began triaging his patients based on the severity of their injuries and their chances of survival. It was one of the most difficult decisions a field medic could make, but his training had prepared him for exactly this situation. He re-established Martinez's IV line and checked his chest tube, then moved to assess Thompson's head injury. The big sergeant was bleeding from his scalp, but his pupils were reactive and his breathing was steady, suggesting that the injury might look worse than it actually was. Johnson, still in his original position, was calling out weakly for help. His arm wound had begun bleeding again, probably due to the stress and movement caused by the explosion. As Marcus worked frantically to stabilize his 3 patients, he could hear the sound of approaching aircraft. The air support was finally arriving, but he wondered if it would be soon enough to save the lives of his wounded teammates. What Marcus didn't realize was that his actions under fire had been observed by soldiers throughout the valley, and that his transformation from overlooked medic to battlefield hero was about to become legend among his unit. The sound of jet engines roared overhead as 2 F-16 Fighting Falcons approached the valley. Marcus looked up briefly from his patients to see the aircraft circling the area, their pilots communicating with ground forces to identify enemy positions and coordinate their attack runs. Despite the promise of air support, Marcus knew he was running out of time. Martinez's breathing had become more labored, and his skin was taking on a grayish color that indicated severe blood loss and shock. Thompson remained unconscious, though his vital signs were more stable than Marcus had initially feared. Johnson was conscious but weakening, his earlier injury compounded by the stress and blood loss from the mortar explosion. Marcus made the difficult decision to focus his immediate attention on Martinez, whose condition was the most critical. Using supplies scattered by the explosion, he worked to improve the chest tube placement and increase the flow rate of IV fluids. His own injuries made every movement painful, but he forced himself to ignore the pain and concentrate on saving his teammates. The first airstrike hit the hillside with tremendous force, the explosion echoing through the valley like thunder. Marcus could feel the ground shake beneath him as the enemy positions were targeted with precision-guided missiles. Secondary explosions suggested that the insurgents had been storing ammunition or explosives in some of their fighting positions. "Rodriguez," Captain Williams's voice carried across the battlefield as the captain made his way toward Marcus's position. "Are you operational?" "Yes, sir," Marcus called back, though his voice was weaker than usual due to his injuries. 3 casualties need immediate evacuation." The captain reached their position and quickly assessed the situation. His uniform was torn and dirty, and there was dried blood on his face from a minor wound, but he appeared to be functional. "Medical evacuation helicopter is inbound, ETA 3 minutes, Williams reported. "Can your patients survive transport?" Marcus looked at his 3 casualties and made rapid calculations based on their current conditions and the time required to evacuate them to proper medical facilities. "Martinez is critical, but transportable if we can maintain his current treatment. Thompson has a head injury but appears stable. Johnson is the most stable of the 3, but he's lost significant blood." As if to emphasize the urgency of the situation, Martinez began coughing up blood, a sign that his internal injuries were worsening despite Marcus's treatment. Marcus immediately adjusted the chest tube and increased the pain medication to keep Martinez comfortable during what would be a difficult evacuation. The second airstrike targeted enemy positions on the opposite side of the valley, effectively cutting off the insurgents' escape routes and eliminating the remaining sources of incoming fire. For the first time in over an hour, Marcus realized that he could no longer hear the sound of enemy weapons. "All enemy contact has ceased," Captain Williams announced after checking with his other squad leaders. "We have achieved fire superiority in the immediate area." The medical evacuation helicopter appeared over the ridge just as Williams finished speaking. The UH-60 Blackhawk descended rapidly into the valley, its rotor wash kicking up clouds of dust and debris that forced everyone to shield their eyes and cover their patients. The helicopter's crew chief and flight medic jumped out before the aircraft had fully landed, carrying advanced medical equipment and additional supplies. Marcus had never been so relieved to see fellow medical personnel in his entire life. "What do we have?" the flight medic asked as he approached Marcus's position. Marcus quickly briefed him on each patient's condition, injuries, and treatment provided. The flight medic was impressed with the quality of care Marcus had provided under extremely difficult circumstances. "Outstanding work," the flight medic said as they prepared. to move the patients to the helicopter. You probably saved all three of their lives. Loading the casualties into the helicopter required careful coordination to avoid worsening their injuries. Martinez had to be lifted on a specialized stretcher that would keep his chest tube functioning properly during flight. Thompson was secured with head and neck stabilization in case his injury was more serious than it appeared. Johnson, despite being the most stable patient, was weakened enough that he needed assistance walking to the aircraft. As the helicopter prepared to take off, the flight medic turned to Marcus with concern. "You need medical attention too," he said, noting the blood still dripping from Marcus's head wound and the way he was favoring his injured shoulder. "There's room for one more on this flight." Marcus looked back at the remaining members of his squad who were still scattered across the valley in defensive positions. Several soldiers had minor injuries that would need treatment, and the mission wasn't technically complete until they had finished their patrol and returned safely to base. "I'm staying with my unit," Marcus replied firmly. "These injuries can wait until we get back to base." Captain Williams overheard the conversation and approached the helicopter. "Rodriguez, you've done enough for one day. Get on that bird and get proper medical treatment." "With respect, sir, my squad still needs a medic." "What if someone else gets hurt on the way back to base?" Marcus stood his ground despite the captain's direct order. The flight medic shook his head in amazement. "In 15 years of doing this job, I've never seen a medic refuse evacuation to stay with his unit. You're either incredibly dedicated or completely crazy." "Maybe both," Marcus replied with a weak smile. Captain Williams studied Marcus for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, Rodriguez, but you get those wounds treated the minute we return to base." "That's an order." The helicopter lifted off in a cloud of dust and noise, carrying Marcus's 3 patients toward the advanced medical facility, where they would receive the surgery and intensive care they needed to survive. Marcus watched until the aircraft disappeared over the ridge, then turned his attention to the remaining members of his squad. Several soldiers had gathered around him during the evacuation, and Marcus realized that they were looking at him differently than they had that morning. The casual dismissal and mild contempt he had grown accustomed to had been replaced by something that looked very much like respect. Sergeant Thompson's replacement, Staff Sergeant Davis, approached Marcus as the squad prepared to continue their mission. "Doc, I just want to say that what you did out there was incredible. Running through enemy fire to treat casualties, staying focused under that kind of pressure. That took real courage." Other soldiers nodded in agreement, and Marcus heard several expressions of gratitude and admiration from teammates who had barely acknowledged his existence just hours earlier. "I was just doing my job," Marcus replied. Uncomfortable with the attention. "No, Doc," Private Stevens said, speaking up from the group. "Your job was to provide medical care. What you did was way beyond that. You saved their lives." As the squad began their movement toward the final village on their patrol route, Marcus noticed that his position in the formation had changed. Instead of being relegated to the middle where he would be protected but isolated, he was now walking alongside the other soldiers as an equal member of the team. The final village was secured without incident, though Marcus could see that the local residents were nervous about the sounds of combat they had heard from the nearby valley. Children stayed close to their parents, and adults watched the American soldiers with wary expressions. During the village search, Marcus provided medical treatment to several local residents who approached him with minor health problems. An elderly man with infected wounds on his hands, a young mother whose baby had been running a fever, and a teenager with what appeared to be a broken finger that had been improperly set weeks earlier. Word of Marcus's actions during the ambush had spread quickly through the squad, and soldiers who had never shown interest in his medical work before now watched with fascination as he treated the local civilians with the same careful attention he had given to his wounded teammates. "How did you stay so calm out there?" Private Stevens asked as they prepared to leave the village. "I mean, bullets flying everywhere, explosions going off. And you just kept working on those guys like you were in a hospital or something." Marcus thought about the question as they began their return journey to base. "I guess I just focused on what I could control. I couldn't stop the shooting or make the explosions go away, but I could treat wounds and keep people alive. That's what I trained for." The return trip to base passed without incident, though everyone remained alert for possible enemy contact. The insurgents who had survived the airstrikes had apparently withdrawn from the area, leaving behind only scattered equipment and abandoned fighting positions. As forward operating base Kestrel came into view in the distance, Marcus felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion wash over him. The adrenaline that had sustained him during the firefight was beginning to wear off, and his injuries were starting to demand attention. But more than his physical condition, Marcus was processing the emotional impact of what had happened. For the first time since arriving in Afghanistan, he felt like he truly belonged with his unit. The respect he had earned wasn't based on rank or position, but on his actions when his teammates needed him most. Captain Williams walked beside. 6 months later, Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez returned to forward operating base Kestrel as a completely different person from the quiet, overlooked medic who had left for advanced training in Germany. His uniform now bore the chevrons of his new rank, and his medical kit contained equipment and medications that reflected his enhanced capabilities as a senior combat medic. The base itself had changed during his absence. New construction had expanded the medical facilities, and additional personnel had been assigned to support increased operations in the region. But the most significant change was in how people reacted when they saw Marcus walking through the compound. Soldiers who had never acknowledged him before now nodded respectfully as he passed. Officers who had previously seen him as just another enlisted specialist now sought his input on medical planning for upcoming missions. The transformation in his professional standing was remarkable, but Marcus had learned enough about military culture to understand that respect earned through actions was more valuable than respect commanded through rank. His first assignment back at the base was to brief the medical staff on new trauma treatment protocols he had learned during his advanced training. Standing in front of a room full of doctors, nurses, and medics, Marcus felt a confidence he had never possessed before his deployment experience. "The most important lesson I learned during my training," he told the assembled medical personnel, "wasn't about new procedures or equipment. It was about maintaining focus under pressure and making quick decisions based on solid medical principles, rather than panic or emotion." Dr. Chen, who was still the chief medical officer, nodded approvingly from the front row. After the briefing, she approached Marcus with a proposal that would further change his career trajectory. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I've been authorized to offer you a position as the senior enlisted medical advisor for this base. The job would involve training other medics, developing medical protocols for field operations, and serving as the liaison between medical personnel and field commanders." It was another unexpected opportunity, but this time Marcus didn't hesitate in his response. "I accept, Dr. Chen, but I have one condition. I want to continue going on field missions with units that need medical support. I don't want to become purely an administrative position." Dr. Chen smiled. "I wouldn't expect anything else from you. Your field experience is exactly why you're qualified for this position." Within his first week back at the base, Marcus was assigned to accompany a patrol led by Captain Williams to the same valley, where the ambush had occurred months earlier. The tactical situation in the area had improved significantly due to successful counterinsurgency operations, but medical support was still essential for any mission outside the base perimeter. The squad that assembled for the mission included several familiar faces, but also many new soldiers who had arrived during Marcus's absence. Private Stevens, who had been promoted to corporal during Marcus's training, was now a squad leader responsible for training newer personnel. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Stevens said as they prepared for the mission, "I've told these new guys about what happened in this valley last year. Some of them think the stories are exaggerated." Marcus looked at the group of young soldiers who were preparing for what might be their first combat patrol. They reminded him of himself 6 months earlier, nervous, eager to prove themselves, and probably unaware of how quickly a routine mission could become a life or death situation. "The best way to prepare for unexpected situations," Marcus told the group, "is to train hard, follow protocols, and remember that your most important job is to bring everyone home safely." The patrol proceeded without major incident, but Marcus noticed that his role within the unit had evolved significantly. Instead of being positioned in the middle of the formation for protection, he was now consulted on tactical decisions and treated as a senior leader whose input was valued by officers and enlisted personnel alike. During a rest break in one of the villages they visited, an elderly local man approached Marcus with a medical concern. Through an interpreter, the man explained that his grandson had been suffering from persistent fever and stomach pain for several weeks. Marcus examined the child and determined that he was suffering from a bacterial infection that could be easily treated with antibiotics. After providing the medication and instructions for proper dosage, Marcus was surprised when the grandfather began speaking rapidly in his native language, while tears formed in his eyes. "What is he saying?" Marcus asked the interpreter. "He says that 6 months ago American soldiers saved his son's life during the fighting in the valley. He wants to know if you are the medic who treated the wounded soldiers." Marcus realized that word of the ambush and his actions had spread beyond the American military to the local population. The grandfather's son had apparently been caught in the crossfire during the battle and had been treated by American medical personnel. "Tell him that many American soldiers were involved in helping people that day," Marcus replied diplomatically. "We're all glad that his son recovered." As the patrol prepared to return to base, Marcus reflected on how his perspective on military service had evolved. When he first arrived in Afghanistan, he had seen his role as narrowly defined: provide medical care to American soldiers and avoid getting in the way of combat operations. Now he understood that his responsibilities were much broader. He was a leader, a trainer, a cultural liaison, and a symbol of the military's commitment to preserving life even in the midst of war. The quiet medic who had once struggled to find acceptance had become a respected senior, non-commissioned officer whose influence extended far beyond medical care. The return journey to base took them past the site where the ambush had occurred. The area looked peaceful now, with local farmers working in fields that had been battlegrounds just months earlier. But Marcus could still identify the specific rocks where he had treated Martinez. Thompson and Johnson under fire. Captain Williams, who was still Marcus's commanding officer despite his promotion, walked beside him as they passed the ambush site. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had made different choices that day?" Williams asked. Marcus considered the question carefully. "I think about it sometimes, but not in terms of regret. That experience taught me that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what needs to be done despite being afraid." "Any advice for these new soldiers who are just starting their deployments?" Williams gestured toward the younger members of the patrol. "The same advice someone should have given me when I first got here," Marcus replied. "Don't underestimate the importance of your job, whatever it is. And remember that being overlooked isn't necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes the people who make the biggest difference are the ones nobody notices until the moment when everything depends on their skills and dedication." As forward operating base Kestrel came into view, Marcus realized that his transformation from overlooked medic to respected leader represented more than just personal growth. It demonstrated that heroism could emerge from unexpected places, and that the military's strength came not just from its warriors, but from all the people who supported and sustained them. The ambush in the valley had lasted only a few hours, but its impact had changed the trajectory of Marcus's entire life. More importantly, it had shown him and his fellow soldiers that courage, competence, and dedication could turn anyone from overlooked to indispensable. Marcus Rodriguez had begun his deployment as a medic struggling for acceptance. He was ending it as Sergeant Rodriguez, a leader whose example would influence soldiers for years to come. The overlooked medic had indeed become a warrior, not through violence but through the quiet heroism of saving lives and earning respect, through actions rather than words. Hey Marcus, as they approached the base perimeter, and Marcus could tell that the captain wanted to say something but was choosing his words carefully. "Rodriguez," the captain finally said, "I'm putting you in for a commendation. What you did today was exceptional by any standard." Marcus started to protest that he had only been doing his job, but Williams held up a hand to stop him. "Don't argue with me on this one. Your actions saved lives and demonstrated courage under fire that deserves recognition. More importantly, you showed every soldier in this unit what it means to put your teammates before yourself." As they passed through the base's main gate, Marcus realized that this day had changed him in ways he was still beginning to understand. He had proven to himself and to his unit that quiet dedication and medical expertise were just as valuable in combat as marksmanship and physical strength. The overlooked medic had become a warrior in his own right, not by taking lives, but by saving them. The base medical facility was buzzing with activity when Marcus finally arrived for treatment of his own injuries. Word of the ambush and his heroic actions had spread throughout the compound faster than he had expected. Medical personnel who had worked alongside him for months but rarely engaged in personal conversation were now greeting him with smiles and expressions of admiration. Dr. Sarah Chen, the base's chief medical officer, personally examined Marcus's injuries despite the fact that such treatment would normally be handled by a junior medic or nurse. The cut on his forehead required 12 stitches, and his shoulder had been dislocated during the mortar explosion, requiring manipulation to restore proper positioning. "You're lucky the shoulder injury isn't worse," Dr. Chen said as she applied a sling to immobilize the joint. "Another few inches of movement during that explosion, and you could have suffered permanent nerve damage." Marcus winced as she adjusted the sling, the pain medication beginning to wear off now that his adrenaline levels were returning to normal. "How are Martinez, Thompson, and Johnson doing? Have you received any updates from the hospital?" Dr. Chen smiled as she finished securing the sling. "I thought you might ask about that. I received a call 20 minutes ago. All three are stable and expected to make full recoveries. Martinez required emergency surgery to repair internal bleeding, but the chest tube you placed probably saved his life by preventing his lung from collapsing completely." The relief Marcus felt was overwhelming. Throughout the return journey to base, he had been worried that his field treatment might not have been sufficient to keep his patients alive until they could receive proper surgical care. Thompson regained consciousness during surgery. Dr. Chen continued. Apparently, the first thing he asked about was whether his medic was okay. The hospital staff said they'd never seen a patient more concerned about someone else's welfare than his own. After completing his medical treatment, Marcus was ordered to rest for the remainder of the day. He returned to his bunk, expecting to find the usual quiet atmosphere of soldiers engaged in personal activities like reading, writing letters, or playing cards. Instead, he found nearly half his unit waiting for him in the sleeping quarters. Soldiers who had never shown interest in his presence before were now eager to talk to him about the day's events and to express their gratitude for his service. Private Stevens, who had been one of the most distant members of the unit, approached Marcus with obvious emotion. "Doc, I need to apologize for how I've treated you since you got here. I thought medics were just support personnel, not real soldiers. What you did today showed me how wrong I was." Similar conversations continued throughout the evening as soldiers sought Marcus out to thank him personally and to acknowledge their previous misconceptions about his role in the unit. The barrier that had existed between Marcus and his teammates for 6 months was dissolving before his eyes. Sergeant Davis, who had taken over Thompson's leadership responsibilities, sat down on the bunk next to Marcus as the evening wound down. "I've been thinking about what happened today," Davis said, his voice serious. "In all my years in the Army, I've seen soldiers do brave things for medals, for promotion, for recognition. But what you did was different. You risked your life because it was the right thing to do, not because anyone was watching or keeping score." Marcus found it difficult to articulate his feelings about the day's events. The recognition felt good, but it also felt somehow beside the point. He hadn't run through enemy fire or treated wounded soldiers under bombardment because he wanted to be a hero. He had done it because his training and his personal values had left him no other choice. "I appreciate what everyone is saying," Marcus replied carefully, "but I hope this doesn't change expectations for future missions. I'm still the same person I was this morning. I still have the same limitations and the same job responsibilities." Davis nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly what I would expect you to say. But here's the thing, Doc. You're not the same person you were this morning, and neither are we. What happened today changed all of us." The next morning brought an unexpected development. Captain Williams summoned Marcus to his office for what Marcus assumed would be a routine debriefing about the previous day's events. Instead, he found Captain Williams meeting with Colonel Patterson, the base commander, and Major Rodriguez from battalion headquarters. The presence of such high-ranking officers suggested that this was more than a simple debriefing session. "Specialist Rodriguez," Colonel Patterson began formally, "your actions yesterday have been brought to my attention through multiple channels. I've received commendations from your squad leader, your captain, and the medical evacuation crew that transported your casualties." Marcus stood at attention, unsure of what was expected from him in this situation. His interaction with officers above the rank of captain had been limited during his time at the base. "More importantly," the colonel continued, I've received a call from the hospital where your patients were treated. The trauma surgeon specifically requested that I pass along his professional assessment of your field treatment. In his opinion, your medical intervention was comparable to what he would expect from a combat medic with years of experience rather than someone with your relatively brief time in the field. Major Rodriguez stepped forward, with a folder in his hands. Specialist Rodriguez, based on your demonstrated competence under fire and the recommendations of your unit leadership, we're offering you an opportunity for advanced medical training and promotion to the rank of sergeant. Marcus was stunned. The promotion would mean increased responsibility, better pay, and recognition of his professional capabilities. It would also mean leaving his current unit for several months of training at a medical facility in Germany. Sir, I'm honored by the offer, Marcus replied. But I need to ask about my current unit. They'll need medical support while I'm away for training. Captain Williams smiled at Marcus's response. That's exactly the kind of thinking that made us confident about this recommendation. Don't worry about the unit, Rodriguez. We'll have temporary medical support, and frankly, having you return with advanced training will benefit everyone in the long run. The meeting concluded with Marcus accepting the promotion and training opportunity, though he wouldn't begin the advanced program for another 6 weeks. In the meantime, he would continue his regular duties while also beginning some preparatory coursework. As Marcus left the colonel's office, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just 24 hours. Yesterday morning, he had been an overlooked medic struggling to find acceptance within his unit. Today, he was being promoted and offered opportunities for professional advancement that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. But perhaps the most significant change was the way his fellow soldiers now interacted with him. The respect he had earned was genuine and based on demonstrated competence rather than rank or position. For the first time since enlisting, Marcus felt like he truly belonged in the military. The overlooked medic had not only found his place as a warrior, but had also discovered that heroism came in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest courage was shown not in taking life but in preserving it.